No worries.
Hi, everyone. It's Dr. Sheftal again with Truth in Science. There's something wrong with my video, and so we're going to go ahead and try it this way and do our best. Okay, so today we've got the great Dr. J. Bhattacharya with us again for part 4. We have vaccines to talk about today, which is going to be really interesting. So please stay tuned and enjoy it. Good morning, Jay.
Good morning. How are you, Reed? Nice to see you.
Fine. I know, thanks. All right, same here. Let's see. So let's go ahead and there. Did it change for you, Jay?
Yes.
Okay, great. So again, this is my bona fides page, and there's not much to this other than tests I've taken. I did teach physics at a university for a year when I was 21, so that was kind of weird. Okay, and this is Jay. Jay's great credentials. Boy, I'll tell you, Jay, you went to Stanford when you were about 17, and how old were you when you'd gotten all that education?
I've been here. I've been at Stanford. I'm 53 now. I've been to Stanford basically continuously. I left for a couple of years at UCLA, Rand.
Okay, wow. So you are now a professor, so you've pretty much spent your whole life since you were a late teenager there, right?
More or less, yeah.
Well, I can think of a lot worse places to be. I love that campus.
It's pretty.
Yeah, it's a really great place. Okay, we've done all 4 of these. These are on the contents, the beginning of the contents. You see those, don't you, Jay?
Yep.
Okay. And we did herd immunity last time. We were just beginning the vaccine, so let's go ahead.
Sure.
I won't even read the contents because I've read them a few times, but I did find this, Jay, and this fascinated me. What would be the word for it? Let's see, a guideline that was created in 2003, lasted all the way until March 24th, 2020. And on that day, it was changed to the one that we use now, which created the red rectangle there, as far as the number of cases are concerned. And had we left the protocol, the guidelines alone that we created in 2003, the number of cases would have been 9,684. Now, isn't that amazing?
So deaths. What is so? This must be the issue around whether to count someone with comorbidities as a death from COVID or from not from COVID.
Well, yes.
Yeah, because I vaguely remember this issue. This was like a at least if I'm I don't remember this particular graph, but I remember this issue. The issue came up of how do you count COVID deaths?
Right.
What is a COVID death, right? So respiratory disease, it's very common for respiratory disease to kill older people to have multifactorial causes of death. Like you can have somebody who dies, let's say a diabetic. The diabetic gets coronary artery disease. Coronary artery disease causes a heart attack. The heart attack causes your lungs to fill up, your congestive heart failure, your lungs to fill up, and then you get COVID. And COVID, so which killed you? Was it the COVID, pneumonia, the heart attack, the congestive heart failure? What killed you? I think this slide you're showing is a statistic that says, okay, we're only going to look at people without comorbidities and count them as COVID deaths. Anyone with comorbidities, you don't count as a COVID death. And then you get this 16 times number. Although I have to say, I didn't realize that was the old method of counting it.
Yeah, now
Only people without comorbidities.
Oh, sorry. Could that possibly have affected the way they counted SARS-1? Because they were using the old system then.
It's possible, although there wasn't much SARS-1 in the United States.
Correct, yeah. A little bit got in Canada, if I remember correctly.
Yeah, Toronto, I think, had a little outbreak.
Yeah. So this is amazing, though, isn't it? Really, when you think about this, I mean, this was changed on March 24th, 2020. I had already calculated it from the cruise ship by then. You know?
Yeah. Well, I think the counting of COVID cases and COVID deaths is actually much more controversial than people may realize, right? So because of this ambiguity about who comorbidities, normally you would let physicians decide that on the death certificate, for instance, what the primary cause of death is. They changed this, I think, like based on like this idea that epidemiologically you want to capture all of the things where COVID is involved at all. And so there's this paper by John Ioannidis who looked at then the other issue of like COVID cases, right? Can you identify who is a case? Is a case someone with a positive test? Is that a case, or is someone with positive tests and symptoms? No, I mean, normally with most diseases, we don't count or look for asymptomatic cases. Is people with no symptoms and like we talked about this before, yeah. And normally you wouldn't count them as cases at all. You just wouldn't enter the count.
Well, they wouldn't be cases; they would be infections, but not cases.
Yeah, exactly. So I think the thing is so there's this really interesting paper by John Ioannidis where he basically argues that in richer parts of the world where there's lots and lots of testing, we've overcounted cases, whereas in poorer parts of the world we've undercounted them.
Possibly because they couldn't afford to waste all that money counting asymptomatic random people, which is sort of
correct.
They tried to test everybody here, which was ridiculous. But
yeah,
okay, but this is an interesting slide, isn't it? It really shows you how an arbitrary decision on guidelines can show you how the numbers can completely scare the public or not scare them, basically.
Yeah, no, I think that's you just hit the key issue. How do you present? I mean, these are just basic facts. Like most of the people that died of COVID had comorbidities, lots of them died with COVID, had comorbidities. It's how do you present that fact? And how do you, and the way that's presented changes the perception of the public about the danger of the disease. The disease is not an enormous threat to people with no comorbidities. It's a threat to people who are older, primarily. Yes. Excuse me, with multiple comorbidities.
Yeah. If you want to make a quick analogy to the flu, in 2017, 2018, bless you, are you okay?
Thank you, I'm fine, yeah.
In 2000, pardon?
Allergies.
Allergies, oh my heavens. In 2017, 2018, 79,400 people died of the flu in the United States. And not a single average person that didn't have symptoms was tested. Right? And the world pretty much, the United States pretty much operated as usual. There might have been a few articles in various newspapers saying it's a terrible flu season, avoid sick people, or something like that. But look at the difference in the way things were handled last year. It practically took the entire world apart for 2 years, caused death and destruction on a colossal scale because everybody was scared of this thing. And it looks like they were all scared of it because a decision was made at the CDC to change the guidelines on how cases, but right here it's talking about deaths, of course, how deaths were counted, which of course relates to how cases are counted. And that's the point I've been trying to make the whole time. When you call things cases that should not be called cases because the people could not possibly have died of COVID, you have really done a great disservice to the public.
Yeah. No, I think that's exactly what you said, Reed. I think what happened is these statistics really gripped people's minds.
Absolutely. That's why when I came up with 0.1% from the cruise ship, with some assumptions, but reasonable ones, and the other guys, the CDC and all these people had it at 4%. And then you guys confirmed it with the serology testing, right? Correct?
Yeah.
If they had allowed me to speak to any of the major networks or anything big enough where people could have heard me, I'll tell you, I don't think the public would have agreed to go into lockdowns if they knew the infection fatality rate was the same as the flu. And that's what it turned out to be.
That calculation you did, it's similar to a calculation that John Ioannidis did right around that time. He wrote a piece in Stat News, a very famous professor here at Stanford. Mm-hmm. And it got a little bit of attention, but he got absolutely hammered over it.
Oh God, you mean by just the internet?
by other scientists, the
Oh,
internet
wow.
and other scientists,
Wow.
and it was, they basically ignored it. People started writing hit pieces on him.
Oh God. Well, I got really strange things when I would mention this on the internet in a chat room or something. Oh my God, some of the people just went after me like crazy.
Yeah.
But anyway, let's go on. This is a very interesting slide, though, in the history of what happened. Don't you agree?
Yeah, it is.
Amazing. Just a simple policy decision to change the guidelines might have caused all this problem. Okay, now I did want to clarify this. Since my picture is non-existent, I'm going to move you up to a nicer place. Can you see yourself now?
Yeah, well, I don't see your view. I mean, it's, my view doesn't
Oh,
change.
okay, well, I'll read what you can't read. I just moved your face.
Oh no, I can read the slide. Yeah.
Oh, good. Remember when I proposed this idea that we reach herd immunity on January 11th for the wild type? And
Yeah.
you agreed with the statements I made below the graph, except that was the seasonal bump over, which made a lot of sense for you to bring that up because this is the first season we'd ever had in COVID, except for March, April, and May of 2020, which was really the late season of 2019. Don't you agree with that? You can't
Yeah, I
have
mean,
two winter seasons in 1 year.
so like in 2020, the seasonality I think was a little funny, just because we had a immune naive population, and that changes, the dynamics of the spread of it to some extent. What it'll eventually look like, what the seasonality of SARS-CoV-2 will eventually look like, I don't think we know for certain yet, but I think it's clear that it's winter. Well, we tend to see a big wave, and then in certain climates we see in the summer we'll see a big wave.
But well, let me ask it to you this way. Is there any reason to think that it will be significantly different than the flu?
I think that summer wave, I don't think the flu commonly has that, but I don't know enough about the flu to know for certain that it doesn't have that. I think my understanding.
It's a summer wave that happened with the Delta variant.
Yeah.
That there were other reasons for that. The only point I want to make here is two quick points. One of them, the March, April, May initial rise in cases and deaths in the United States. Remember, New York had a horrible time. That's sort of where it started. And then it moved down to Florida, Texas, and Arizona. Then it went up sort of the Midwest up toward Wisconsin, then the plain states, and then the mountain states, and then it went way out west. So that's kind of the way it went. And that was based on the climate zones that the different states are in. Would you agree with that?
Yeah.
Okay. Then that happening at the March, April, May was really the winter season of 2019. Because remember, this thing started in China. It does take some time to travel to the United States. And when it built up enough to make a lot of people sick, it was still that initial 2019 winter wave.
Yeah, I mean, this I agree with. So I completely agree with. I think that essentially that year, that first year, the seasonality was mixed in with the fact that it was arriving for the first time. You have an immune naive population, so the seasonality we ultimately end up with, now that our population is mostly no longer immune naive, is going to look different than what we saw in 2020.
Yeah, but I do still think it'll be in the cold months by and large.
Yeah, I agree with that.
Okay, so what I did was just to try to argue my side of the case, was I went and looked at the flu. It turns out the flu season, the official flu season, is from October 1st to May 31st. It's October through May. And that graph that you see with that histogram you see down there with the blue bars on it, those are the ranking by month where the most cases occurred. So, February wins. March and January are equal in that thing. So I think January 11th, which is only the first third of January, couldn't possibly be beyond the end of it, is all I would say.
Well, I think we will always have a winter wave. That seems clear. Whether we have also a summer wave in certain climates
Yeah.
is not yet clear to me. We may actually.
Now, what's really interesting, it's good that you brought that up. You got that, that's very interesting that you brought it up, because it's actually true. You know, there's coronaviruses that cause the common cold, there's adenoviruses, and there's rhinoviruses. And the rhinovirus peak is in the summer for the common cold. Isn't that amazing?
Yeah.
They do sometimes peak in the summer. You wouldn't think so, but they do with rhinoviruses.
I mean, these viruses compete with each other. They look for little niches, or their own niches.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's going to be a complicated story. There may be things we have yet to learn about how they compete with each other, and they seem to like they like the rhinovirus peaking in the summer. It's because it doesn't compete with the other viruses in the winter, or the respiratory viruses in the winter. I mean, it's complicated.
It's a big fish in a small pond, kind of.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? So anyway, what I did was I put those vertical bars on the graph that I showed you yesterday. And I still stand by, and I think you probably agree with me, that we did reach herd immunity there for the wild type.
Yeah, I mean, in the sense that the decline in cases means that the RT is less than 1. That's by definition.
Right.
And that happens when the one additional person spreads the disease to one or few people. In that sense, we were above the herd immunity threshold. Now, part of that is also like this is like what, like late 2020. What is this? What months are these? Oh, this is 2021.
Oh yeah, this is this is less than a year after it started. It was gone. In other words, it started in New York in about maybe March or April, right?
Yeah.
And then it was gone by January 11th, which is what it should do. And then of course it'll become endemic, and there'll be a little bump every winter from it.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, I made this little Mickey Mouse estimate here as to what I thought happened numbers wise. And, I calculated 155 million exposed by the 20th of September. Then immunity in place, it's a bit of a guess, but I think it's about a third of the population of the United States. Now, the official population of the United States is 332 million. But there are a lot of people who are not part of the official count. And I think the real count of people living in the United States is about 365 million. It's about 25 million more than they tell us, because, there's a lot of undocumented immigrants and stuff here, a lot. We're talking 2 or 3 tens of millions are here now. It used to be 11 million, but that was like 25 years ago. And there's certainly way more now than there used to be. People from Central America and so forth, right? So the real population is about 365 million. So a third of it would be 120 million. I put 100 down. I don't want to overestimate everything. So then we're at 255,000 when Dr. Parsonet said we weren't anywhere near herd immunity. Actually, we were getting there because we were just going into the winter season. And my guess there is that we got about 90 million more from September 20th to January 11th. And when it hit 345 million exposed and protected, that graph went straight down because the virus couldn't find anyone else to infect. Is that reasonable logic?
I mean, it's a completely reasonable story. I mean, whether it's obviously built on some things I wish we'd had better data on.
I agree.
With assumptions, but consistent with a decline.
One of the problems with even predicting 90 million from September 20th to January 11th is, I'll tell you, I took a slide out where I had used calculus to figure out the area under all these curves, and I was going to compare them to calculate it exactly. The problem is, like you said in one of our earlier videos about when you've got a large peak, because they are recognizable cases, people with symptoms. And then you see the graph go way up later after we started testing everyone. Remember that, where you pointed out that ratio changes?
Yeah.
Okay. that's what happened here, of course. I mean, back in March and April, the cases that we were counting, most of them really did have it. But when you get to November and December of 2020, most of the cases they were counting did not have COVID.
Yeah.
You know, they were just positive PCR tests, which really don't mean much. Certainly they weren't new cases. But anyway, so that was my estimate. And I'll tell you, I think it's very close. Because remember that slide that I always call the most important slide of the pandemic? That tells me that 50% of people in that study already were protected against SARS-2 without ever being exposed to it. So the immunity in place thing is not a negligible number. We're looking at a third, maybe 30%, but it's something like that. Now, this is where we stopped last time. Boy, I sure wish I could get my box off of there. Can you read that okay?
Yep.
It says, if you've already had and I assume disease, do you have to get the vaccine? And that's where I started to say, no, 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 no. And you said, wait, it's more nuanced than that. So let's start. And can you tell me why it's more nuanced than I thought it was?
Yeah. So to me, this is an empirical question, right? So what's the marginal benefit measured? And the key marginal benefit for a patient is protection against severe disease if they get COVID. And so there are some studies that indicate that if you get sick and recover, you do still get some benefit from the vaccine in terms of reductions in now it's not a huge benefit. It'll depend on who you are. Like an older person, I think, gets more of a benefit. So the recovery from COVID or the first vaccination provides an enormous benefit, especially for older people. Then the vaccine on top of the original recovery provides a smaller benefit. It's not zero, is my point. The other thing is there's this cross protection against potentially future variants, right? So if you have a new variant, the vaccine, they call it hybrid immunity, may provide better protection against severe disease from a future variant potentially.
Okay, can I just ask you a question about that?
Sure.
When you talk about the benefit of a vaccine, which evidently there are studies that show having had the disease and recovered plus the vaccine is better than just having recovered from the disease. Yeah,
no, I don't think that benefit is huge. So I think for people for whom COVID is not a severe disease, like younger people, the benefit is small, almost zero.
Well, can I say that you should include the negative aspects of getting a vaccine also, and they're not zero either.
Completely agree with that. So this is an individual. That's why I say it's nuanced. It's an individualized decision based on the patient's characteristics.
Correct.
Right. So if you have a patient that has characteristics that even after natural immunity, getting COVID is still somewhat dangerous. Like, let's say take somebody who's like 80 years old. I think the infection fatality rate for an 80-year-old with a lot of comorbidities might be something as high as 5%. Even
if they've already had the disease and recovered?
Yeah. So let's say they've had the disease and recovered. That gives it, maybe it'll reduce it to 0.5%, tenfold. And the vaccine will reduce it further to like 0.2, 0.3%.
Okay.
That's a significant benefit for them. And then you weigh that against
relative risk of about 100%. In other words, you're
yeah, I'm overestimating the benefit of the vaccine, but let's say that's true, right? So I mean, let's go. Okay, let's not overestimate. Let's go from 0.5 to 0.4%. All right, so that's a 0.1% reduction, 1 in 1,000 decrease in the risk. Right. Then you compare that against the harms of the vaccine. In older people, the harms are like a elevated risk of clotting, I think.
Yeah.
The vaccine, there's some others. I think that could be worthwhile. I mean, it could be worthwhile to have that trade-off. Again, is for a particular patient. For a young person, the math is completely different, right? So you have a COVID recovered patient who's young. Their risk of dying was already quite low, on the order of 1 in 100,000.
I'm going to show you some graphs in a minute that'll just spell it out real well.
Yeah, and so there the vaccine adds epsilon reductions in severe disease risk for the young person who's without comorbidities.
Yeah.
And then you have the myocarditis risk and all these other side effects. So
Right.
that's what I mean by it's nuanced. I don't think you can say yes, no automatically for everyone. You want to like do the math for each patient based
Yeah.
on the characteristics they have.
Yeah, in general, I agree with you. And that's why I couldn't understand doctors calling for vaccine mandates, because you have to know the characteristics of the individual patient before you recommend them having a vaccine or not. How could you mandate a vaccine as a doctor, knowing that people are so very different? It has to be
Yeah.
done on an individual basis.
Well, I think part of it, in fact, almost all of it, was a misunderstanding what this vaccine can and can't do.
Right.
The vaccine, I think, if there's a case to be made for it, it's this protection against severe disease. If the case it can't do, what it cannot do is stop the transmission of the disease.
Right. Now, I've got the primary efficacy endpoints written out, which we're going to discuss in just a second, which relates to this, right?
Yeah, no, I mean, I've seen this trials. The trial didn't check for transmissions halted.
It was really interesting what they chose as the primary efficacy endpoint. You know, you can choose death if you want. You can choose lots of things. So I think we have a little bit of this goes back a little bit to me being kind of black and white on the issue and thinking that if you get a disease and you don't change the sequencing of the virus, so it's the same virus, and you don't have some major issue with your immunological response changing, that you cannot get the disease again, except maybe 1 in 100 million times or something. So that's why I would say no to this. I mean, if I had gotten the disease and recovered from it, and I'm old, I'm sure I'm a lot older than you, I would never have gotten that vaccine. Because
I agree. I think for the vast majority of people,
yeah,
it probably doesn't make sense if you're COVID recovered to get the vaccine.
Yeah.
Now, again, there may be cases where for a particular patient it makes some sense. And also, I say like I think the fact that it might protect against future variants, this hybrid immunity, better than just COVID recovery alone. That's an argument, I think, for it.
Well, I don't like that idea, because the vaccine codes for the it provides the messenger RNA that codes for the spike protein, which, as we spoke about before a few times, the spike protein changes a lot. I mean, you know, people say, oh, it's changed about 4 times, right? Well, maybe 400,000 times it's changed. I mean, the variants, there's lots of changes, and sometimes a variant emerges as strong enough to sort of make a name for itself. But that thing change. Think about what mutations are, which cause the variants. They're copying errors. You know, when that virus gets into the host cell, like the human lung cell, for example, pneumocyte, it's got to make a lot of copies of its own messenger RNA, and it makes a lot of errors when it does that. And that's where the mutations come from. So every day there's thousands of mutations that are occurring, most definitely.
Yeah.
We're going to go on because we have so many slides that relate to exactly the points you made in just a second. So they'll come up in a second. Again, this is the same thing on March of 2021. Now, this is a few months after the vaccine had come out. They had a CNN town hall, and Dr. Fauci said, you should get the vaccine even if you've had the disease, because the antibody response, and I watched the video and made sure I quoted him properly. The antibody response from the vaccine is equal to or greater than from convalescent serum. And that's actually true. And it's by about 4 times. You know, the vaccine makes way more antibodies to the spike protein than getting the disease does.
But who cares? I mean, that's irrelevant.
And so I say, but he's forgetting T cells, which are more important than B cells in viral infections. And of course, the much more broader protection you receive from having had the disease. I've listed the spike, M, N, and non-structural proteins, and there's 17 more that you get a reaction to. So again, these are some of the details that lead me to feel like you don't have to get the vaccine again if you've had the disease. But Dr. Fauci said that you did, but I've got a videotape that I'm going to show you in a second that's going to blow your socks off. This is almost the same slide as before, though. I just wanted to give you the actual quote, because remember, I mentioned that Atul Gawande and Scott Gottlieb had also said that the vaccine gave you better protection than the disease. And it ruffled my feathers a little, because these vaccines certainly for certain parts of the population are not a good risk-benefit ratio if you've already had the disease.
Yeah.
So here we go. Here, and I just repeated this slide only because if you wanted to refer to the quote he made, but let me listen to this. This is Dr. Fauci, obviously a little bit younger, maybe in the 90s, let's say, or late 90s. Listen to this.
But she's had the flu for 14 days. Should she get a flu shot? Well, no. If she got the flu for 14 days, she's as protected as anybody can be, because the best vaccination is to get infected yourself. And so she should not get it. If she really has the flu, she definitely doesn't need a flu vaccine. If she really has the flu,
she should not get it again.
No, she doesn't need it, because it's the most potent vaccination is getting infected yourself.
Now, when you see something like that, it really makes you wonder, doesn't it?
Well, okay, so let's try to be fair to him, as fair as we possibly can to him.
Absolutely, and let's be as gentle. And I felt a little bad because I was a little bit critical at the end of the video last time, and I made a little thing at the very end thanking you as which just
I don't think there's no problem with us disagree. I mean, this kind of disagreement is fun, actually, Rita, and I think it's clarifying.
I'm not talking about that, but I mean, I want to light into Dr. Fauci for telling people to get it.
So let's be as fair as we possibly can about that. So he's talking about a flu. He's talking about COVID, and he's talking about a flu vaccine, not the COVID vaccine.
Correct.
And so maybe, just to be as charitable as we can be, maybe the situation was different then, or in his view, the situation was different. And that's why it explains the difference between how he reacted then and how he reacted now. I think, and with the flu, of course, it wasn't it's a flu, but it's not. It's a different variant of the flu, but maybe he thinks that we understand the immune response for the flu much better than we understand the immune response for this.
But that's awfully charitable, because I'll tell you, if you wanted to think of one disease that you could make some analogies with, to me it would be the flu. This COVID.
Well, I think, or with the other coronaviruses, Reed, right? So
sorry.
Or with the other coronaviruses.
Sure.
I mean, this is a coronavirus. I think he's never said this, but like it's interesting to me that so many of the people that are in charge of public health are people who like sharpen their intuition about infectious disease with HIV.
Yeah.
Like he's acted as if the reaction of the body to this disease might be like HIV in some sense.
But I would fault him even more so if he really thought that, because HIV, the virus is harbored in the T helper cells. It damages the immune system by its very existence. Whereas
it kills your T cells, it kills your ability to react, and it sits there for years before the really bad stuff happens.
Yes.
And of course, there's no natural immunity after infection at all. In fact, it kills your ability to react in HIV.
Yes.
But
that's
not the right basis for thinking about this virus. This virus is a coronavirus. Coronaviruses produce a pattern of immune behavior that's nothing like HIV.
Right.
It produces immunity.
About the flu here, and the flu is close, and certainly SARS-1 would be close.
Yeah, SARS-1 is another example of where that's the sort of the right analogy, right?
All right,
So
let me use SARS-1 then. I showed again, the most important slide of the pandemic, the second part of that, the second most important slide, remember it was 2 slides, that showed that the N protein, the protein that stabilizes the RNA inside the viral capsule,
Yeah.
the T cell response to that way back in 2003 still protected the 23 people that were still alive that had it, that they found 17 years later.
Yeah.
And not only did they protect people from getting SARS-1 again, but they protected people from getting SARS-2 because the N protein was the same still after 17 years. In other words, it's part of the replication process is not affected by copying errors for some reason. And again, it's because the viruses, like we always humanize them, want to change the spike protein a lot so they can get into a lot of different animals. And that to me is as close as you can get. And certainly what he said makes no sense based on that. And my data that 17 years later, people are still protected by it, from getting the disease. It just, what he said doesn't make any sense based on what he said this year.
Yeah, I mean, and I think the reasoning he gave about the antibodies, that makes no, that's besides the point.
That makes no sense either.
Like, why didn't he have the same intuition he had when he was talking about the flu so many years ago?
Well, unless he did it on purpose. Now we're getting into accusations, which
no, I tend not to go that direction. I mean, I think
you don't. You're such a kind person. I'll tell you, I'm not as kind as you, and I'll tell you, Jay, I try to be kind. You're a kind person, but if I try to be kind, I run out of rope very quickly. I mean, he is telling people here that they must take the vaccine because there's more antibodies in the vaccine than there are from getting the disease. We're talking about antibodies to one protein that changes every 5 minutes, right? Compared to response to all 17 plus 1, 2, 3, 4, 21 proteins that you get a response to when you get the disease. I mean, I can't think of any logical reason. It kind of is analogous to when at first he said, oh, there's no reason for everyone to be walking around with masks on. And then a couple months later, when nothing had changed, he's starting to tell people they must wear a mask. And then a couple months after that, we want you to wear 2 masks. You know, principles are ideas that do not change.
So there was one other let me try one other argument that I heard around the time.
The same thing with masks that he's doing with the vaccine here.
Yeah, I mean, I tend to agree that this was a big mistake on his part. But let me tell you, like, one other argument I heard around that time in 2020, having to do with natural immunity.
Okay.
And and then later potentially with the vaccines, the idea of antibody dependent enhancement.
Yes,
I've
got a whole set of slides on that in just a minute.
Oh, okay. So we'll wait on that then.
Pictures. Yeah, you know, what is funny about you and I is when I make up a set of things that I think are good to talk about, it's amazing how you come up with the point and it's just a few slides away. And of course, you haven't seen these slides. Isn't that
you know, the thing is, Reed, I've been struck is like, I mean, obviously we have some differences in how we think about this, but we are arriving at roughly the same place regarding the policy.
The difference in it between you and I so far, except for a few things, you know, just a few things like herd immunity, which I think you probably agree with that too. Remember you said Sunettra.
Yeah, no, I think the question of I don't understand fully the mechanism as yet, but I do agree with the broad epidemiological fact that we've had it. I think the thing is it's interesting in science when you arrive at the same place from different places, different ways. That gives you more confidence in the ultimate conclusion.
Remember I told you that the analogy with taking the SAT math when I was younger, I could do the problems fast. So I could actually I had time to do them all twice. And I did them different ways on purpose. And if I didn't get the same answer, I went, let me see, I must have made an arithmetic mistake or something. And every once in a while I would find one. But if I got every question I got the same answer on every single question. I knew I'd gotten it right because I went about it two completely different ways.
Yeah.
But anyway, that video of Dr. Fauci is really something, isn't it? It's as shocking to me as the one of Dr. Ezike in Illinois saying that even if there was a clear alternative cause for death, if they had a positive COVID test, we called it a COVID death. Now that's pretty shocking too.
Yeah.
So the reason I put this slide up here is when I gave this a video earlier on in the year, I wanted to help people understand how the vaccine worked. And but now, you know, with you, we can look at it a little differently and talk about why they made the decisions they made. So we know that there's a nanolipid capsule that covers the messenger RNA vaccine, and that's so that the messenger RNA can get inside the cell easily, because the lipid of the vaccine will meld with the cell wall of the deltoid cells, for example, right, where it's being injected, because that's lipophilic too, the cell wall. But you know, I learned something else interesting about the way they did the lipid coat, you know, for the vaccine. They made it so it would interact with a LDL receptor, low density lipoprotein that carries cholesterol. You know, a lot of people call it bad cholesterol or good cholesterol, whether it's LDL or HDL, but really it's a cholesterol carrier, as you well know, low density lipoprotein. And the reason it's lipoprotein is if it was just a lipid that was carrying the cholesterol, it wouldn't be soluble enough to flow in the blood. And if it was just a protein, it wouldn't be able to get into the cells. You know, it wouldn't be able to get the cholesterol into the cells. So it has to be a lipoprotein. It has to have water soluble components and lipid soluble components, so it can dissolve in the blood and get into cells, right? Well, they made this nanoparticle out of lipid, and it interacts beautifully with the LDL receptors on cells. So really, the vaccine particles that are injected that have the messenger RNA inside can get in two ways. They can get in without a receptor, or they can go in through the LDL receptor, which greatly increases their ability to get inside the cell, which is clever, okay? But once it gets inside, it does what a virus does, and that is the messenger RNA joins up with the ribosome, and using transfer RNA makes the proteins, okay? Makes the polypeptide and then the proteins. And when I first showed this to people and I learned about all this, and I knew that they were making the vaccine produce the spike protein and only the spike protein, I said, you know, in the video, I said, I wonder why they chose the spike protein only. Because spike proteins change a lot, which makes the possibility, which has come true, that variants could occur that the vaccine does not protect you against, okay? This is way back in, I don't know when, maybe early, whenever they announced it, a week later, I had the thing out. And I sort of tongue in cheek mumbled under my breath, maybe they want to sell more vaccines. Because if they all they had to do is put a little bit of the code for the N protein in there, knowing that study that I've already cited that shows that they got 17 years of longevity out of having SARS-1. They could have put a little bit more code in this messenger RNA, and instead of just making the spike proteins, they could have made spike proteins and N proteins. And that might have changed the whole course of this whole thing. I don't know why they only put spike protein messenger RNA in there. Do you have any idea why they would have done?
I mean, I have to say, this is one of the things where I definitely got this wrong at the beginning of the pandemic. I thought that there was no way they could have a vaccine candidate it would take years, I thought. but they seem to have had a vaccine candidate almost immediately after the disease
Well,
arrived.
all right. Well, can I first say something about that before you get to your punchline? They've been working on this vaccine for a long time. The reason I know is I looked at Daszak's. Remember when I read parts of Daszak's grant proposal to you, and you did point out correctly that this is just a grant proposal. This doesn't mean he's been doing it. But then when you go and read that tweet that he should not have sent, that was found by somebody, that says, "Oh yes, we've found we found more than 20 bat coronaviruses, and we've injected them into bats, and we've just seen if the monoclonal antibodies work or a vaccine works," all that stuff. In other words, they were making the vaccine since at least 2014, maybe earlier.
Yeah.
He admits it there.
I mean, I agree.
So they did you know that Moderna and the NIH actually share the royalties from the vaccine sales?
I do know that. Yeah.
Now that's amazing. That tells you something right there, doesn't it? That shows you that the NIH is really involved in this business of making the vaccine along with making the virus. I hate to.
So that's like financial motives. But let's consider the counter argument if we can, just to be fair, right? So the counter argument is that they've been working on the vaccine for a long time, so they know stuff about. I mean, this presumably, if that's true, they must have had some experience with other configurations of the mRNA that's in it, and the obvious thing to do would be something like you suggested. Why not include some of the other proteins that are coded in coronaviruses?
And they don't change.
Yeah, I mean, like they've been trying. I mean, you've heard Fauci talk about this, about trying to get a universal coronavirus vaccine. I mean, there must be some experience with those other proteins that maybe I just don't know about it. It's possible.
But when you think about it fundamentally, there's really no reason for the N protein to be a reject compared to the spike protein as far as the vaccine is concerned, except that it is inside the capsule. So the antibodies can't get to it too easily. So you want something on the surface, but there's a lot of proteins on the surface too, There's the M protein, and there's a few others that are right there as visible almost as the spike protein. Certainly an antibody can go gum up the works by hitting the M protein.
But the thing that maybe that they're worried about is like antibody dependent enhancement. Maybe they're worried that somehow the N. Now I don't think it happens. I think it's false. It doesn't actually happen. But maybe this was what they were worried about. Like with the dengue fever vaccine, that was a disaster, right? That's actually.
So was the vaccine for SARS-1. All the what are those animals called? Ferrets. The ferrets that were vaccinated compared to the control group, the placebo ferrets, the ferrets that were vaccinated all died when they exposed it to the wild type of SARS-1. Because I think they got antibody dependent enhancement and they all died from it. And that's
so maybe that's what they were worried about, right?
Huh?
Maybe that's what they were worried about. But they should need it. I don't see so now that we've tried to do the counter argument, let's try to take apart the counter argument. How would they know that the spike protein wouldn't cause antibody dependent enhancement either, right? Like they don't have any clinical data. They're deciding what the mRNA ought to look like. Why did they decide that spike protein by itself wouldn't cause antibody dependent enhancement?
It would be more likely to cause it, because what you have in dengue fever is you have 4 types, right? And in order to get antibody dependent enhancement and have a worse course the second time you get dengue fever, you have to be infected by one of the other 3 types. In other words, you have to get one of the 4 types the first time, and then you have to get infected with one of the other 3 the second time for the disease to be worse.
Yeah.
Because it's similar, but not the same. And so the antibodies aren't quite as efficient at completely neutralizing the virus. So all they really do is stick to it and then act as a handle for the SC receptors on the macrophages to pull it in the cell, and then allow it to hijack the machinery at a much more efficient rate because it's being pulled in easier. You follow me?
Yeah.
like putting a handle on it, and the macrophage just grabs the handle and pulls it in.
Yeah, I mean, this is all
Didn't
this,
have
and this
that
is all like,
antibody handle. The macrophage had to endocytose it.
they had to pick one. I mean, that's the key thing here, right? So it's, let's say April 2020. They're like thinking about what the mRNA candidate ought to be.
Yeah.
They are only going to get one shot at this. Operation Warp Speed is going. They have to pick their best shot
Yeah.
for the massive clinical trials that they're going to do.
Right.
And so they went with just the spike protein,
Right.
presumably by looking at, I mean, it's one thing to say financial motives. I mean, that's also, I think it's certainly possible.
Yeah.
And I've heard about, like, Bill Gates, for instance, talk about the mRNA vaccines like essentially like software, right? We just substitute in a different code and it'll work differently. But it's interesting that they haven't been able to do that. They haven't altered the mRNA in these vaccines to keep up with the variants.
That
So it's
blows
not
my
like
mind
software.
too. Because when you get, again, going back to the flu, when you get the flu vaccine, you're supposed to take it before the season starts. And the reason we take a certain one in the United States is they've already gone over to Hong Kong where they start, and they've looked at the hemagglutinin and the neuraminidase antigens on the surface, the H5.
Yeah, and they make a guess, right? So if it was in Hong Kong, or
they measure it, but they know they make an educated guess, let's say, on which antigens are most likely to be the antigen of the year, kind of. And then they make the vaccine based on what they think it's going to be. And they're usually 50% right at best.
yeah, I mean, it's so, like, I just saw an estimate. This year's flu vaccine was like 15% efficacious. I mean, it's they just guessed wrong. And how could they guess right? They didn't have very much data about the particular H and N antigens that were going to show up, because the flu disappeared everywhere.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of polymorphism in it, which means that there's a lot of different shapes that those things can configure themselves in. And if you're wrong, it doesn't work very well.
Yeah.
If you're right, it might be 70% one year. If you're wrong, like you said, 15%. But the spike protein is changing all the time. In other words, we're making an argument not to use the spike protein. And that's the one they chose. So there must be a reason why they chose it. And there must be another reason why they didn't put both of them in there.
Yeah.
That's what I don't understand.
Well, I mean, so like I said,
codons for the N protein in there, and you'll have something that doesn't change when the variants change.
Yeah. I mean, it could be finances, but I think, this is like, vaccine making is hard, right? You have to get, and a lot has to go your way.
A lot has to go your way. And I'll tell you something, with this vaccine, a lot did not go their way. And I'm going to show you a few things in a minute. So on this slide, the really important thing to know is that when the spike protein is made, because it was made inside the cell, a proteasome is going to chop it up into peptides, which will go onto the major histocompatibility complex protein class 1, which will be moved to the surface of the cell and recognized by the T killer cell. And this cell here is going to be killed, because the CD8 cell is the T killer cell, which is going to kill this cell by apoptosis, because it recognized a foreign peptide antigen in the context of the class 1 MHC. Now, the reason the spike, this is really fascinating to me. The reason the spike proteins over here go out of the cell, they get released and then taken right back in by endocytosis, is because the class 2 major histocompatibility complex presents antigens that come from the outside. You understand what I mean there? Lysosomes break it up, and then it gets presented in the context of class 2, which
you get the T cells
recognized by a T helper cell, which cannot kill the cell. And this all makes sense because if it's, say, a macrophage, you don't want to kill the cells on your own team, right, that are helping you. But you want to kill random pneumocytes that are filled with viruses. Remember that black and white electron micrograph we showed that was just filled, and that was only a two-dimensional picture of it. We want to kill cells like that. And all those proteins to assemble the viruses are made inside the cell from the genetic material released into the cell. But when proteins are picked up from the outside, we don't want to kill those cells. That's why it's presented in the context of class 2, and that's why the T helper cell recognizes class 2. And it sounds like a lot of medical mumbo jumbo, not to you, because you know it all, but somebody like a layman just will get lost when I start talking about the major histocompatibility concepts. But I'll tell you, it's really important.
Yeah, no, this is really important, right? So there's a few things that are important about this. One is that you have both antibody-mediated immunity and cell-mediated immunity happening as a consequence of this,
right,
of the vaccine. Also, wouldn't work at all. They would have no chance.
Yes.
The second important thing is that the spike protein has to escape the cell in order for the antibody-mediated immunity to work at all.
Yes.
Right. So that means that there could be side effects if the spike protein ends up in places that shouldn't end up.
Absolutely. But there's even a bigger reason why they end up in places that they shouldn't end up. And I've got a slide to show you that in just a second. But isn't this interesting the way it works?
It is, yeah.
Because,
I mean,
the B cell, the antibody side of the acquired immune system will not work without a T helper cell stimulating those B cells to differentiate into plasma cells and make all these antibodies. So if you didn't get something from outside the cell here and let it be presented in the context of class 2, major histocompatibility complex, the T helper cell is not going to be stimulated for that particular antigen, and you're not going to make antibodies to it.
Yep.
Now, I just, for the benefit of the audience, really fast, we won't have any disagreement on this. A lot of people ask me, why do some vaccines last longer than others? So I just wanted to throw this in real quick. A live attenuated virus provides the longest lasting protection because it's a live virus, but it's a very, very weak example of a live virus. And you're still able to make antibodies and a good T cell clonal memory and response to it, but it can't hurt you. And the measles vaccine is a perfect example of that. That's live attenuated, and that's why nobody gets the measles twice. And when I say nobody, maybe there's been 1 in 100 million, I don't know, but basically nobody gets it because we all have measles virus still living in our body right now if you got the vaccine. Actually, it came from some kid in the 1950s or something, I remember, from medical school. They actually inject everybody with a live measles virus that turned out to be very, very weak, and they found it in a person, which is interesting. Then you've got the subunit vaccines, which are components of the virus or the bacteria that will stimulate an immune response. Some have adjuvants and some don't. Adjuvants, of course, increase the response. The SARS-2 vaccine is a subunit vaccine. It's making the spike protein. It's not the whole thing. It's not live attenuated or killed. You can also have killed vaccines injected into you, which are the organism, and it's been completely killed, maybe with formalin or something. So it absolutely can't hurt you. By the way, the polio vaccine is live attenuated. Remember the Sabin Salk?
Yeah. So, but there was a fight over that, right?
Yeah,
So, like,
I think the one that I think, well, the one that's live attenuated actually accounts for more polio cases every year than the wild type. So the live attenuated ones can get you sometimes. It's very rare. As you know, in Pakistan and where I'm from, Cambodia, and a few other places in Southeast Asia, it's possible to have a few polio cases every year.
Yeah. You know, polio has actually come back, Reed. I don't know if you know, in places that did.
I read there were 600.
Because what happened was that because of the lockdowns, a lot of kids didn't get their vaccines in 2020 and even up to 2021 around the world.
Yeah,
and polio come back.
I'll tell you, that's why that histogram that I showed on the first slide really makes you wonder. It really hurt a lot of people to be telling everybody there were that many cases. Okay, COVID is a subunit vaccine without an adjuvant, et cetera. So it's incorrect for Fauci, Gawande, and Gottlieb to think the vaccine made from a single spike protein will confer the same degree of protection as that afforded by the virus itself.
They said it's what they assumed it would be better. So weird.
They thought it would be better, and that blows my mind because they knew it was a subunit vaccine. They know their live attenuated is way better than a subunit vaccine. I'm going to show you a histogram in a minute that shows you how long these things last, and it's crystal clear. I knew it in medical school. What's going on here? But the other thing that's troubling, let's say, is the CDC changed the definition of vaccines this year. In the same way that they changed the definition of herd immunity, which you and I both thought.
I didn't know this. I didn't realize they did this.
Look at this, Jay. They changed it from vaccine, a product that stimulates a person's immune system to produce immunity to a specific disease, protecting the person from that disease. Vaccines are usually administered through needles, but can be administered by mouth or sprayed into the nose. They changed that to a preparation that is used to stimulate the body's immune response against diseases.
Stimulate the body's
immune response. Get the specificity out of it. There's no immunity to a specific disease in the second definition. Can you believe they did that? So I just made a few examples of things that would fit the definition of a vaccine, which show you how absurd the definition change is. Vitamin D would be considered a vaccine because it certainly is used to stimulate the body's immune response, isn't it? Remember, vitamin D, there's a vitamin D receptor that gets inside and it affects the DNA.
I didn't know that they'd done this. Why did they do this?
Look at this, Jay. Vitamin B, B6, vitamin C would be a vaccine according to this definition. Water, interferons, and so forth would be considered vaccines according to this definition. The CDC took specificity out. Isn't that amazing?
Why did they do that? That's so weird.
Well, I mean, let's say that they realized at some point that this thing was not going to keep people from spreading or, getting the disease.
Right. So like the key thing is stimulates immune system to produce immunity. This thing doesn't do that. This thing protects against severe disease, but it doesn't make you immune in the sense of preventing you from getting the disease.
The only thing I would say, though, is what they didn't want people to be able to accuse them of was calling something a vaccine that really wasn't a vaccine. I mean, think about what a therapeutic does. That also protects you against severe disease, right?
Yeah. I mean, in that sense, it's more classically a prophylactic drug.
Yes.
It's like the HIV medicines, right? So the HIV medicines protect you against progression into AIDS.
Yeah, that's right. So they're not vaccines, though.
No, they're not vaccines.
But they would be according to the definition change. And that's what bothers me about it, because a lot of people have asked me, do you think this COVID vaccine is a real vaccine? And I have to say no, because it doesn't.
But it doesn't meet that top definition, that's for sure.
Now the flu vaccine doesn't either.
Now, okay, so now let's try one more time. Try to be as charitable as we can. All right. So product that stimulates a person's immune system to produce immunity to a specific disease.
That's reasonable.
Let's take immunity less strictly than we normally would.
Okay.
Immunity doesn't mean you can't get the disease. Immunity just means you have some protection against that disease.
Right. Against a specific disease, though.
Yeah, against that specific disease. In that sense, it's a vaccine, right?
Yes, it's certainly, that's a good definition. Fair enough, let's say.
They should have just stuck with that first definition and said immunity, there's a broad range of things that immunity can mean here.
Yeah, correct. They should have left the specificity in there, though. That's where they made a mistake, I think.
It's crazy that they're playing with basic definitions of basic medical facts that we've known that have been around forever.
You know what it is, Jay? It's the same as changing the rules of the game after it started, after both teams agree on the rules. That's not good, because that makes people not trust them. There's nothing to hang your hat on. You know what I mean? As a doctor or a scientist or an epidemiologist like yourself, I mean, you need some definition so you can speak to other colleagues and you guys know what you're talking about.
Yeah.
I think this is a mistake for these guys to be changing the definition of herd immunity, which was absurd. And then this is ridiculous too, isn't it?
It is. I agree. I didn't know they did this.
Now, here's a quickie, but you'll see why I put this up, just for the layman, not for you and us. But you see that influenza and COVID, they last on the order of less than a year, and we know that now. But measles, the top green line has the arrow going on forever, and it certainly does protect you forever. You've got live measles virus in your body right now if you have the vaccine. Hepatitis A is 20 years, but again, hepatitis A is a disease that is treated with an inactive or killed virus and also an attenuated virus. There's both kinds of vaccines, okay? But something like tetanus is a subunit vaccine, like say COVID-19's vaccine is, but it has an adjuvant, which stimulates the immune response to a much stronger profile and clonal memory. So tetanus will last 10 years. Whereas, the COVID vaccine is going away in about 3 months. I mean, it's horrible as far as that criterion is concerned. I'll tell you though, if it truly prevented the spread of the disease and lasted 6 months, it'd be okay to get a shot every 6 months to never get it. I mean, that wouldn't be a problem. The problem is that getting that shot every 6 months, especially after the variants come in, is showing us that it's not doing anything really.
Yeah, I mean, I think that what you just said is the most important point, right? So a vaccine, as a public health measure, rather than just a medical measure to protect somebody from some disease, is as a public health measure, it has to stop transmission. It absolutely has to.
Yes.
And if it doesn't, then it's not really a public health measure anymore. It's a private health measure in some sense. Private in the sense that it may help some individual against the ravages of that disease,
yes,
but it won't protect others for very long.
And here's the thing, Jay. They completely messed up the description and the explanation to people. And I'm talking about the TV doctors and Fauci and these guys that are supposed to know, when they said that we needed to get a certain percentage of the people vaccinated to reach herd immunity, these vaccines don't help herd immunity at all. They really don't. As a matter of fact, they make it worse because they keep people alive that can spread it to other people. Think about it.
I'm not sure if that makes it worse, but
the likelihood of herd immunity less than if the vaccine wasn't even there. And they're talking about needing 90% of the people vaccinated to reach herd immunity. And you saw my proof yesterday that we reached herd immunity without a single person being vaccinated.
I mean, I'm not sure I'd go so far as to say it made it worse. I'm not convinced about that.
Well, it keeps people alive. Let's say you have 1,000 people and you give them the vaccine, but it doesn't prevent any of them from spreading it to other people.
Yeah, no, I think there's a behavioral question.
I'll explain why. I think it's worse when you're vaccinated, actually.
Well, okay, so let me try to make a counter argument just briefly about what, because I agree with you that it doesn't contribute to natural immunity, to herd immunity, right? Because it's the question is whether it makes it worse. I think it depends on the behavior of people after they've been vaccinated, right? So if you're vaccinated and then you decide that you're immune, you'll go visit grandma, then you otherwise wouldn't. It can spread you can end up spreading the disease more than you otherwise would have without the vaccine.
Bingo. That's my point.
Right. So that's true, but that's not the same as that it stops herd immunity. In a sense, like the disease then spreads more.
Yeah.
Then you get to herd immunity faster.
Huh?
Then you get to herd immunity faster. Ironically, because the disease spreads more, you get to herd immunity faster. Now you can get a larger fraction.
The more infectors you have, the worse off you are, right?
Yeah, well, so the question of herd immunity versus like the total burden of the disease, those are two different questions. So
yeah,
I think the burden of the disease generally with the vaccine is reduced because you get reductions in severe disease.
Yes.
The total number of infected people is my guess is it's probably a higher or about the same. I haven't decided on that yet.
Let's say you want to call it the same. Can I throw an idea in there?
Well, I mean, it really depends on that R number, right? So if you change your behavior such that there's one person infected, then infects multiple extra people, then the total component of people at the end of the wave will be smaller. One over 1 minus R naught will be smaller because R naught is higher once you've vaccinated the population. This is according to your argument. I'm not convinced by that yet. I haven't seen enough evidence to convince me that's true. But at the very least, it doesn't reduce the total component of uninfected. All it does at the end of the wave is it reduces the morbidity from who's infected.
So it'll increase the number of infected is what it'll do.
Well, in my view, I don't know that for a fact. I'd say it either increased or had no change.
Okay, can I throw an idea at you?
Yeah.
Would you rather be, or a question, would you rather be at a party with 100 people that had recently been vaccinated, or would you rather be at a party with the other, there's 101 people at the party and you're one of them. So the other 100 are either all vaccinated or the other 100 are not vaccinated at all. Which party would you rather go to?
I got in trouble a little for a tweet that I did on this exact thought experiment a few months back. If most of those people that are unvaccinated are also COVID recovered, at least some fraction of them.
No, I'm not talking about that. That's not fair. You can't sneak that little COVID recovery. In other words, does the vaccine make things better or worse for transmission?
Yeah,
this is a little bit like that problem you asked me the other day about the 3 doors or the 3 windows or whatever it was.
Yeah, I think the so like you're the way you phrase the question.
Yeah.
There's some key fact I don't know. So like, for instance, I think the vaccine, okay, let's ignore the 2 weeks after you've been vaccinated, originally jabbed. After that, for 2 or 3 months.
Let it be after 2 weeks.
Yeah, I think for about 2 or 3 months.
You're not vaccinated until it's been at least 2 weeks.
I think it still has. I think it has some positive efficacy against infection for, let's say, 2 or 3 months, maybe 4. It by 4 months or 5 months, the efficacy against infection drops pretty close to 0.
Yeah, to 0. Absolutely.
Right. No, but that's so like if that room full of vaccinated people is only 2 months after vaccination, that's, I think, the peak of its efficacy against infection. Then that room would probably be safer, assuming that there's no one in the other room that is COVID recovered. They're all just immune naive.
Yeah, I'm not. Let's pretend that none of the 200 people are COVID recovered.
Yeah, but once you add COVID recovery, then it becomes so easy, right? So if a lot of people have had the disease and recovered, unvaccinated people who had the disease and recovered are probably less likely to spread the disease to you than vaccinated people who've never had the disease.
Absolutely. That's a no-brainer.
So why are we making vaccine passports, pretending as if you created a space just filled with vaccinated people, that's going to protect people from getting the COVID when it doesn't?
Because people are stupid. I mean, let's face it. Why would you have to get on a plane with a test or a proof that you've had the vaccine before you get on the plane? Now, that makes no sense at all.
Yeah, I mean, I think what's happened is
because I'll tell you why.
It's like doctors and public health people that have bought into this. They have some sense of what a vaccine ought to be like, and they haven't looked at the data for what this vaccine actually is like.
If they don't know that this vaccine does not prevent transmission at this point, they should have their medical license surrendered. I'm not kidding. This has been in the news for years.
I'm not sure I go that far. I mean, I'm kind of against. I think we should have a robust debate.
I am too. But let me tell you the answer and why I think this is the answer. Now, I could be wrong on this because you did add some nuances about how long after vaccination. The problem with the people that are, you'd rather be at the party with the people who have not been vaccinated yet. That's got to be the answer. And here's why. The only thing you care about is whether the other person has the disease or not. Because if they don't have the disease, they can't give it to you anyway. But a person who's been vaccinated, correct me if I'm wrong, has a very good chance of having a symptom reduction compared to a person who's not been vaccinated.
Yes.
So that viral load in that person who has been vaccinated but doesn't have the symptoms is the same as an unvaccinated person, let's say, but that unvaccinated person that would have the symptoms that the vaccinated person doesn't have, he's at home in bed. He's not at the party.
Yeah.
So you've got a lot of vaccinated people walking around that truly can spread it to people because they don't think they have it.
Yeah.
Whereas a person who's not vaccinated, if they have the same viral load that that vaccinated person has, they can't even go to the party. They're at home. They're sick. You see
Yeah.
what I mean? So you'd rather be at a party full of unvaccinated people because the people that have it have symptoms too, and they're home. But at the
Yeah.
vaccinated party, there's a ton of people in there that
Thing
don't
is,
have
I think the thing
symptoms
about
'cause
that,
the
Reed,
vaccine knocked the symptom out. Do
you
you
got
agree with that logic?
no. I mean, I the logic is right. The question is like how empirically important is it? So, I think even people who are unvaccinated to get the disease, get infected, many of them have relatively mild symptoms also.
But again, you're talking to the guy who doesn't think asymptomatic people can spread it. And I still don't think they can.
Yeah, so I think that's really the issue. So I don't know, as I was talking about earlier. So maybe that's the source of the difference.
In
I think
other
it is
words,
still,
here's the bottom line. The vaccinated people are artificially asymptomatic, and that's a very dangerous thing.
yeah. So I think
They've got big
I
viral
think,
loads. They just don't have symptoms.
so the thing about the danger around that, the question is like, if I'm old and I get the vaccine, I'm as protected as I can be, as far as severe disease is concerned. The kind of like the premise that we can somehow protect ourselves
What
from
about
a highly infectious respiratory virus, I think is a problem itself. Like it's an illusion of control over this virus we just don't have.
this virus? Yeah, but I mean, the measles is a respiratory virus.
Yeah, I know, but
It's just
that's why
that
we have
this
the vaccine. The
vaccine is
vaccine,
no good. I mean, I know there's some aspects of it that are good. It's really not a very good vaccine, let's face it.
well, I think the main thing is that symptom reduction, right? In people who
Yeah.
have a high risk of death if they get infected, I think the
It could
vaccine
benefit them. It could benefit them, and it could even
Yeah.
win the benefit risk race.
Yes,
But
and I
let me
believe it
show you
does.
my calculations on something that I did the night the data came out. I'll tell you, talk about having people yell at you. I got about 25 emails from different doctors. And then I'll show you the nicest thing that happened to me the whole year. But isn't this interesting to show you how different the vaccines are and why? Now,
Yeah, and measles. I
here's
mean,
the problem.
just to go back to that measles, because it's a really important point you're making here about the vaccines. Go back one slide, would you?
Okay.
Because that's a really important slide there.
Yeah, it is. It
Not-
looks simple, but it's important.
It that measles, that the fact that it lasts so long is important, but also it's important is it stops transmission. You get that vaccine,
Absolutely.
you are not going to be transmitting measles to anybody.
Yes. Now you remember
Completely
how
different than this
contagious
vaccine.
measles is. If you didn't have something that stopped transmission in measles, we would be in big trouble. That thing is super contagious.
Yeah.
And that's why the herd,
And-
you need 95% of the people protected or you're in trouble with that thing.
Yeah.
Remember-
So, and that's why like measles, it's very important that nearly every kid get it.
Yes,
Because if you
95%.
don't, it'll come back.
They've got to have 95 out of every 100 kids get this thing for sure, or they've got a big problem on their hands. It's so
Yeah. So I mean, and so there you really do have a public health justification for essentially requiring it. Now you can
Yes,
do
but
it
I
different
think,
ways.
let's put it this way. You can require it as long as the person doesn't have a doctor's excuse.
Yeah, no, I'm not saying that
doctor's
we shouldn't be flexible. Like
excuses
there's,
why
like you
he
said, they can have
cannot-
5% that don't get it, but
Yeah.
it pretty much needs to be pretty close to universal.
It's close to
adoption.
abandoned, but it still can be not gotten if you have a doctor's excuse, certainly.
No, I think Reed, I'd say it this way: is like, I generally am against coercion
Yeah.
in basically in these kinds of decisions. These are personal health decisions, but you make I am very strongly in favor of good information. And I think my philosophy is that if you give good information to people, they'll mostly act the right way.
Of course, yeah.
And so I think you don't necessarily need coercion. So let's leave the coercion aside. I think the end result that we both agree on, you need a very, very large fraction of the population
Oh, yes. And I'll tell you a good empirical piece of evidence. About 5 years ago, if I remember correctly, there was a little faction in the United States that decided they didn't want to give any vaccines to their children, and they didn't give them the MMR vaccine, measles, mumps, and rubella. And there was a huge measles outbreak. Something like 300 kids in the Midwest got it. Do you remember this?
Yeah, no, but this happens periodically. I mean, I remember when I was in college in like 1989, there was a measles outbreak across the U.S. Actually, New York had an outbreak.
There you go. I mean, that thing is on the tipping point all the time. It's so contagious.
Yeah, so you just need a very large. Whereas this vaccine cannot possibly accomplish that. This COVID vaccine cannot accomplish that. It does not stop transmission.
Yes, and
so it doesn't have
is
any.
really the key. I mean, it's nice to have a vaccine that knocks a few symptoms out, depending on the way you look at it. Of course, it makes the disease spread faster, though, like I was saying. It's going to spread faster.
I'll
There's too many contagious people walking around that don't think they have it. That's the
So
problem.
I think the only disagreement here, Reed, is whether there's a greater than sign or greater than and equal to sign.
Yeah, okay. All right. Well, we'll call it even on that. But you see my point, though, about these vaccinated people that have no symptoms because the vaccine knocked them out, and they're singing and coughing in people's faces at a party because they don't think they're sick.
Yeah.
If an unvaccinated person had the same viral load, they'd be at home in bed.
Yep. Okay. Next slide.
All right. Okay. Now here's a real problem. The vaccine produces a lot of spike proteins. Now that was a bragging right to Fauci and some of these other guys saying it was better than the disease. But I'll tell you, too many spike proteins is not a good thing. Because, you know, it gums up ACE2 receptors, right? We know the spike protein docks with the ACE2 receptors, right? When you have a vaccine, when you have a vaccine and you've got 4 times as many spike proteins going around, you're gumming up a lot of ACE2 receptors, right? But the ACE2 receptors is the antagonist for the ACE receptor. And of course, ACE2 stands for angiotensin converting enzyme 2. And ACE receptors, ACE, convert angiotensin 1 to angiotensin 2. And angiotensin 2 is a bad thing. So ACE2 receptors and ACE receptors are in a balancing act all the time. And when you gum up a bunch of ACE2s, you're making the ACE receptors higher relative to the ACE2s, right? And the ACE receptors convert angiotensin 1 to angiotensin 2, which is a very bad actor. Angiotensin 2, I know you know the renin-angiotensin system. Angiotensin 2 increases blood pressure by being a vasoconstrictor, by increasing your body water, and believe it or not, increasing your desire for salt. But it also increases inflammation. Angiotensin 2 does. It's a big inflammatory agent. And this is part of the reason why we're getting all these blood vessel problems and heart myocarditis and all that, because with all those spike proteins running around, the angiotensin 2 is wreaking havoc on everything.
So I'll say this about I've seen other mechanisms proposed for the like they say the myocarditis or like the idea is like you have essentially endothelial damage from cells that are marked for cell death by having spike, you know, the MHC1 system engaged. I guess I don't think we yet know the mechanisms.
Hang on. In order for the endothelial cell to be killed, right, by the MHC1 cascade, the virus or the vaccine would have to get into that endothelial cell, right?
Yeah. Well,
spike protein and be presented on the surface in the context.
Yeah. So I know. So like this. So the idea is the exosomes escape the deltoid.
Yeah.
They float around and then they enter they stick and in some endothelial. Anyways, my point is not to bring up and say that that's the right mechanism. My point is to say I've seen literature that suggests that that there's a lot of hypotheses about the mechanisms by which these
Well, I
things
agree.
happen.
That's fine. I'm not saying my explanation is the only explanation, but I'll tell you, you don't want too much angiotensin tubes running around.
So let me just say this. The key question to me from the epidemiological point of view is how common are these side effects? And
Well,
it's not a single answer to that question because it'll depend on the patient, right? So for instance, the myocarditis risk is substantially higher in young men than it is in young women or older men and women.
Yes.
I have no idea why that's true. I don't know why that is, but I can tell you it's true based on the epidemiological data. It's so clear. I think
the histograms in a minute, and it's going to blow your socks off.
And then there's the clotting disorders too, right? So the clotting disorders for the Janssen vaccine ended up it was like actually relatively young women, middle-aged and young women that had an elevated risk.
Right.
But the key question on what the use of the vaccine is how frequent those are relative to the benefit. These are the harms. You have to compare it against the benefits. As we said earlier, it's always going to be a patient level thing. Each patient will have some different configuration of characteristics that may make it right to take it in one case and wrong to take it in another case.
That's why I said before that I'm really against mandates on something like this, because you need to, every patient is different. It might be a 23-year-old male that you really have to wonder why you would give a vaccine like this when myocarditis has come on the scene. Because he's in the prime myocarditis age, 18 to 24. And again, for a female who might be 23 with a history of DVTs, you got to really wonder whether you should give her the Johnson & Johnson.
Yeah,
right?
You wouldn't.
So yeah, you wouldn't. So you have to, because these two people don't die from COVID either. You got to keep that in mind all the time.
Right. And so I think like I've said this from December of 2020. I've said this when I first heard about the vaccine. This is, I believe, a strong case to be made for giving the vaccine to older people and people with high risk of dying from COVID.
Yeah.
The benefit there is really high, and even though there is some uncertainty about the side effects, those side effects are really common and severe in order to offset the benefit from the reduction in risk of death from COVID if infected.
Yes.
For older people. For younger people, it's very different, the calculus.
Totally different.
Now, I can imagine some younger person with, like morbidly obese or have a whole bunch of of characteristics, medical characteristics that make the benefit higher than it is for the typical young person.
Yes. Oh, absolutely. And you gave us the formula. You said that having obesity would double your risk.
Yeah.
Didn't you?
Of death. Yeah, exactly. Or type 2 diabetes, I think, also doubles the risk of death. I mean, so I think I can imagine, a 35-year-old diabetic, obese man who would benefit from the vaccine.
What about a 450-pound 18-year-old? That's a big problem.
Absolutely. Yeah. So I think there are clinical situations where the vaccine is net beneficial even for the young, but it's going to have to be on a case-by-case basis. It's something a doctor should advise you about based on your own personal risk characteristics, not something that should be mandated at the population level, pretending as if it's like measles, where really where if everyone got it, would go away. It doesn't.
Yeah, so why were all these doctors endorsing mandates? I saw on these things like Medscape or something where it's a forum for doctors and they make comments on the side. Boy, I said something like this should be considered on a individual basis, and man, people went after me like you wouldn't believe, saying you're a killer. Why don't you agree with the vaccines? They're saving everybody. Of course, they were wrong about that too, and I'll show you all kinds.
Well, I think this idea that a vaccine can reduce the risk of severe disease, but not stop infection is not. Most doctors are not familiar with this because most vaccines in common use do both. they stop infection and they reduce the risk of bad disease, bad outcomes.
Yeah,
We're
you
used
know
to think
why?
about that.
The spike protein is toxic, man. I'm not kidding. That thing is dangerous. Don't you agree?
I agree it's dangerous. A question is like, how dangerous? I guess I'm a little less convinced by the evidence that these things you're listing here are common. And I don't, on cancer, I haven't seen any evidence that convinces me as yet that that's true.
On cancer?
Yeah.
Okay, well, let me show you later. Or maybe, you know.
I mean, if you have evidence to show me, of course,
I mean,
I'll consider it.
some of these
I haven't seen
pathologists
any.
are getting on the internet now and saying the incidence of certain cancers is way up, you know.
Well, I mean, I guess it depends on the type of cancer. So like cancers that
sure.
have, so for instance, I think one of the things the lockdowns did is it reduced the amount of screening for the most common cancers.
At least a third of the people did not go in for their cancer screening. And let me
Yeah,
tell
so
you,
you're going to get cancer incidence go up. You're going to get a stage shift toward
for that,
higher stage cancers.
a lot,
That have nothing to do with spike
that is
protein.
truly one of the worst collateral damages from the lockdowns. Is that people
It's
did not
unbelievable that
get screened for cancer.
doctors decided that COVID is more dangerous than cancer.
I know.
How on earth did we come to that?
Here's the ultimate thing. People wouldn't take an ambulance into the hospital when they were having chest pain and they died of a heart attack at home.
Yeah, I
They're
know.
trying to avoid something with a 1 in 1,000 chance of killing you and sitting there in the middle of dying of a heart attack. I mean, it makes no sense.
It really
I
doesn't.
blame the media, and I blame, and I do blame some people in charge here for ginning up the fear on this by inflating the IFR from the beginning. I think that really started us off in a really bad way. 4% instead of 0.1% is 40 times too high, not 40%, 40 times too high. And I know I've heard through the grapevine, you're an epidemiologist, you can correct me on this, but I've heard that certain epidemiologists will always err on the side of over predicting how bad something is going to be. Is there any truth to it?
There's a famous line from Neil Ferguson, who did that Imperial College model.
He was one of the exaggerators, by the way, wasn't he?
Yeah, well, he actually he was interviewed I think by the Telegraph, I forget by who. And it's exactly what he said. It's like, it's better to err on the side of caution. I mean, essentially, it's like it's better to err in the right direction than the wrong direction. Something close to that. Like, it's essentially err on the side of over predicting, because then people take the disease more seriously, and you have a better result than it is to err on the side of under predicting.
Well, it backfired this time, big time.
Yeah, well,
You agree?
I think the right thing for an epidemiologist to do is to aim to neither over nor under predict.
Well, of course, be as accurate as you can. But
do
there's
not
another phrase that you guys use, and I can't remember it, but the principle is do the thing that is the most conservative and safe thing, even if it might not be the precise thing.
It's called the precautionary principle, right?
Okay,
So
what does that mean? That's the word. So what does it mean exactly?
So let me explain that. So generally, the precautionary principle is like, let's say that there's some threat, nuclear war, climate change, or some new diseases popped up.
Okay.
And there's facts that we don't know about this threat.
Okay.
Right? What is the infection fatality rate? What's the transmissibility? We're sitting in February 2020.
Okay.
What should we do in the face of this uncertainty as a policymaker? Well, the precautionary principle says, well, assume that the threat is, at least to some reasonable limit, as bad as it could be. All right, just make an assumption about the worst. Assume the worst. This is like what I think what Neil Ferguson was trying to get at.
Like a 4% infection fatality rate.
Yeah, so assume the worst.
Yeah.
And then decide, if the worst is true, what interventions are likely to be effective to reduce the harm, what interventions are likely, and then and then consider taking those interventions.
If their unintended consequences don't cause more trouble.
Correct. That's also a really important part of the precautionary principle. You can't assume that the interventions are automatically better than the worst harm you can think of from the thing you're trying to prevent.
Like the
have to
lockdowns
compare.
are a really good example, aren't they?
Yeah,
That might have applied to the precautionary principle, but it sure did not give us the precautionary.
well, this is the thing. It's like, if you're going to apply the precautionary principle, you can't apply it asymmetrically as far as the harms you're averting versus the harms of the thing you're using to try to avert the harms. So, for instance, I'm not allowed to assume that the lockdowns will have no harm when I'm addressing this bad thing that I'm assuming is going to happen. I'm also not allowed to assume that the lockdowns are automatically going to work. Those things, the precautionary principle doesn't buy you those conclusions. The precautionary principle, all it allows you to do is assume the worst about the disease, and then ask, then you do cost benefit analyses on each intervention you have in mind.
Well, was it
What are the
done
harms
on,
of the
was it
intervention?
done on the lockdowns? They didn't ask me. I could have told you from the, and I did tell, I told Tucker Carlson from the beginning that it wouldn't work. Because let me tell you why, what I thought of when I did it. I thought of the physics, right? I've already told you about that. The virus is so small that you cannot see that virus with a light microscope. I mean, you can't see the virus any better than you can see X-rays or microwaves cooking your food in a microwave oven. It's absolutely the same reason. So, in order to keep that virus out of people in their houses, you need to open all the windows and put fans in all the windows so the concentration is never high enough so that the viral load can make somebody sick, right? It's like being outdoors, basically.
I mean,
Now,
I'll tell you.
And the
So you had a
example I
physics
give, let me just
reason.
throw this in because I know I'll forget it. I'm getting to the age where I forget everything.
Right.
Remember those diseases where people would be born without like an ability to make T cells or something? D. George
That's thymus or something, yeah.
The little kids that were born with that were called bubble boys, remember? They put them in a plastic bubble. They couldn't even hug their mother, even one time in their whole life. Because if they got out in the real world and one little bacteria or virus blew in their face, they would die. Remember that? Those people that are born without an immune system?
Yeah.
So that is what you have to do to keep a virus out of your nose and mouth. Not a closed oak door at your house. That's not going to do it. Your only chance is to be in an outdoor environment where the density of the viral particles is so low that you will not get sick from it. You won't get a big enough viral load.
So you've given a physics reason. Let me give you a sociological reason why the lockdowns couldn't have possibly worked.
Okay.
In the United States, only about 30% of the population who work in jobs that can be replaced by work from home, by Zoom.
Yes.
There is an enormous sociological disparity in living circumstances for people poor versus rich in the United States, and not just in the United States, basically every society on earth. And so you essentially have a lockdown that only a relatively small, well-off part of the population can truly abide by. The rest of the population basically has to work, has to mix. It's not humanly possible to expect it to not. And so the lockdowns, the ability of people to actually abide by the lockdowns is very time limited and very class dependent. So there was no chance of a lockdown actually succeeding in terms of like reductions in because what's the physics of a lockdown that people think about that makes it attractive to them? They think of a lockdown.
They think of a prison lockdown.
Yeah, or like
a group of rioters that got out of their cell in one cell block. So they lock all the doors all the way around it, and they can't get out of there and turn the whole prison into a chaotic.
Yeah, well, I mean, let's try again. Try to be as charitable as we can. They're imagining rats in cages. If you keep the cages far enough apart, then those rats don't interact. They can't spread diseases to each other. That's the physics people are imagining for a lockdown.
Well, they're wrong.
Right. They're wrong for both the physics reasons you say, but also for the sociological reasons I say. The ability for people to actually abide by this lockdown was never there. And so you, at least for the vast majority, except for the laptop class. And so the lockdown was certain to fail to stop the disease from spreading. And then it has all those collateral harms that we've been talking about.
But this is a place where we disagree in a very peculiar way, kind of. Because I keep going back to Governor Cuomo's list of the things that made people do worse. And one of them was staying at home. So the essential employees did better than the non-essential employees.
I mean, well, let's not revisit that. Let's keep going on this.
Okay. Yeah, we'd end up having the same thing, and at the end, throwing up our arms. So let's not say that, but keep talking about the point you're making, though. I do agree that there's that little subset that truly can order out for food, make a big salary with their laptop, because they're probably financial people or something, you know. That little subset doesn't even get harmed almost at all by the whole thing. Whereas some people just get destroyed by it.
Yeah.
I do agree with that. The difference in the way it hurt people is enormous.
Yeah.
So I agree with that totally. You know, the laptop set really did not get fazed by it at all. Really, did they?
No, I mean, I think generally the laptop class benefited in some ways from the lockdown.
Oh yeah. Listen, I'll tell you, those social media guys and YouTube and things like that, where people had nothing to do but make videos and go on YouTube, they could sell their time for so much higher advertising fee. It's incredible. You know, I mean, imagine the money. That's why their net worths went up by, you know, $2 trillion, about 50 of them. You know, it's incredible.
I don't know if you have friends like this, but there are some friends, they're friends of mine who are like, well, you know, they like working from home. They don't have to drive to work. They don't have to. Their lifestyle, as far as they're concerned, is improved.
Right. I think the students really suffered because of it, though. There's nothing like in-person teaching. Don't you agree?
I completely agree.
Yeah, they really suffered.
Okay, let's go. Let's move on.
Yeah,
you're going to show me the evidence on cancer, because I think this is one place we do disagree.
Oh, really?
I don't know that it increases cancer incidence.
Well, can I just give you a mechanism real fast?
Yeah.
The Pfizer trial, certainly the latest disclosures, clearly demonstrate that our immune systems suffer a loss of white blood cells. You agree with that? You said 2 weeks last week. I said,
yeah, I think for a week or two, that's.
Yeah, a week or two. And you know, the white blood cells, they don't just perform apoptosis on pneumocytes that have been infected with SARS-2 virus. They're going around looking at the antigens on the surface of all of our cells all the time in the context of class 1. And that includes tumor cells. You know that tumor cells present those funny proteins they get when there's a mutation. They present those on the surface too. And those T killer cells are going around performing apoptosis on all these cancer cells in our bodies all the time. So when you screw up the immune system, even for 2 weeks, by messing up our white blood cells, you're going to have cancer surveillance damaged.
I mean, the question is like, how does that show up in the epidemiological data? I just haven't seen it.
Well, give me a few years, because I really think that was a bad thing that happened there. I think the vaccines damage the immune system to some degree, and I've got proof of it in a second when we get to the slides. Let me read the proof when we get to the slides, and then you tell me if you think it's significant.
Okay.
All right. But remember that the T killers are going around keeping us from getting cancer all the time.
Yeah.
Now, here's a question that is not very kind, and so maybe you can tell me why I'm wrong. Why do they vaccinate controls? Now, in some diseases, they do it out of, it's unethical to continue the study. Because, they're finding out that the people that got the baby aspirin did so much better heart disease wise that they stop the study halfway through and say everybody has to take baby aspirin from now on or whatever. You know what I mean?
Although
This
that's
thing,
actually got a revision in recent years. Actually, it turns
oh,
out.
I know it has. Isn't that funny? Isn't that amazing?
Yeah.
All that stuff you could hang your hat on in cardiology. Some of it wasn't right. But anyway, you get the point though. There are times when the doctors think it's unethical to continue. The people performing the study, right? So that could be a reason why they stopped and vaccinated the controls in these studies, right? If they thought the people that were vaccinated were so much better off.
Right.
But I think they did it because they don't want a control group to be able to compare to the vaccinated group over the long term.
Yeah.
You know what I'm
Well,
saying?
I think the argument they made was ethics.
But do you see why I don't buy it? I think it was this reason.
I think this is like let me make an argument for the ethics of this. Then we actually need to stop because I gotta run in a little while.
No.
I'm sorry, Reed. It's 9:30 my time. So we've been at it for 2 hours, so we have to come back
We
again.
can put one slide on here and talk for 2 hours. That's the problem.
Yeah. Well, I think so. The thing is like you have a situation in December of 2020 where the disease is like by perception a really dangerous disease going everywhere.
Yeah.
You have a trial that finds 95% efficacy against symptomatic infection, and so as you're on the data safety monitoring board.
The 95% number, which I derived the night the trial data came out, that's the relative risk reduction.
I know, but let me just say, so you, anyways, you're sitting on the data safety monitoring board. You're looking at the 95% number. You have this misperception about how deadly disease is for everybody, rather than for the particular subgroups. And you say to yourself, okay, if I continue the trial, I'm going to expose these controls to a very bad risk. I think that's what happened. I don't think this was a malign thing. The people on these data safety monitoring boards are not generally, I mean, they're supposed to be independent and not conflicted.
Yeah.
So I think what happened here was that I think that they thought that it was unethical to continue the trial and not offer the vaccine to the controls.
Do you think they understood what the 95% number meant?
Well, I mean, you're gonna. I mean, we'll come back to that, but yeah, I think what they thought of. The absolute risk reduction in that sense is not the right thing to look at, because for much of the trial, those 3 months, the vaccine, the COVID wasn't spreading very particularly strongly in the population at large. So the 95% relative risk reduction, they thought, okay, well, COVID is spreading. You're gonna, if we allow it to spread, if we allow the vaccine to be taken, a lot of people will have this 95% risk reduction. When COVID is spreading high, it'll be actually end up at a larger absolute risk reduction than we measured in the trial.
Well, can I throw a monkey wrench in there? It's not the degree of how fast it spreads that's important. It's the percentage of people that advance to the primary efficacy endpoint without being treated that's important. And if a very, very small number of people get symptoms for this, as we know, there's a lot of asymptomatic people.
Yeah.
Then getting the vaccine does not have a high absolute risk reduction.
Well, I mean, I agree with that. But it varies in the population, right? So like older people.
Oh yes, definitely varies in the population. And when I derived this, you know what the number needed to treat for this thing is? It's 119. You got to
I mean, it's big, but it'll be much smaller in the old population.
Yeah, well, the older population has a very high percentage of chance of getting to the symptoms.
Correct. So that's why
I said there is a subset where it might be a decent idea to give them the vaccine.
Right. So I think this is the reasoning that they didn't do. They were reasoning from the point of view of okay, so maybe we should talk about this next time, because no, actually, Actually, can we take a break for like a little bit and then?
Absolutely. Let's
Yeah,
take a break, and I'll just scissor it out of the whole thing, and I'll wait for you.
Okay, give me 15 minutes, Reed, and I'll come right back.
Take your time, as long as you want.
Okay, let me just take a little break. I think the key thing here is that the key thing here is that they thought for the controls that if there may be some people in the controls for whom the vaccine was beneficial.
Okay.
They thought it was true for everybody.
Can I make the final funny statement here?
Yeah.
They did it to the children too, and the children had almost no risk of this thing. And they still vaccinated all the controls.
Yep. Okay. Let me take a quick break, Reed, and then we'll come back in 15 minutes.
Please take your time, though. Please take your time. I mean, come back.
Okay. No, I'll send you an email very shortly.
Okay, great.
Okay. All right,
so what should I do? Should I? You know what I'm
just hang out for like 10 minutes, and I'll be right back.
Okay. Should we do a whole new? Should we do part 5, or should we just keep going?
Oh yeah. Why don't we do part? Actually, let's reconvene later today with part 4. What you have to sleep.
No, I'd rather finish this because
no. Let's do this. Tomorrow morning your time.
No. Let's do it tonight. I learned in surgery residency, I'd rather stay up for the duration than go to sleep and have the alarm.
Okay. In that case, then give me 10 more minutes, Reed. 10 minutes.
Take 30 if you need to.
And I'll put you on WhatsApp. I'll send you when I'm ready. Okay.
Yeah, no problem. Take your time.
All right. Talk soon. Bye.
Great. How did I come on this thing now? What's going on?